Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, What is Ableism? My name is John Kemp, and I am President and CEO of the Lakeshore Foundation. I'm a white male with white hair and wear 4 prostheses, as I am a proud quadruple congenital amputee. My pronouns are he, his, and him. I'm extremely excited that you've joined us for this webinar, which is part of a 2-part series on disability and ableism. Today, we are joined by 3 great esteemed professionals in the disability movement: Dr. Kara Ayers, Imani Barbarin, and Mia Ives-Rublee. We thank each of you for joining us today. These great leaders will provide all of us with an in-depth look at what ableism is and how it impacts every aspect of the disability experience. They will also give us a call to action on what we can do individually and collectively to identify and reduce ableism. I hope this conversation will continue among your colleagues, friends, and family long after this webinar ends. And now I'd like to introduce Mary Allison Cook, who will be our moderator for this webinar. Mary Allison, please.
Thank you, John. Hello, my name is Mary Allison Cook, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar and conversation. I'm the Associate Director of Communications here at Lakeshore Foundation. I'm also a 2-time Paralympian. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a white woman who uses a wheelchair. I am currently wearing a navy blue top and navy blue sweater, and I have long brown hair. And I am so excited to be here today with these wonderful guests. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to go over a few items as to how you can view and engage with the webinar. You should be able to see live captions at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see those captions, you can just go to your toolbar, click your More button, and turn your captions on if you don't currently see those. If you have any accessibility issues during the webinar, please use the Q&A function to type us a message related to your accessibility concerns, and we can address those if needed. We also have a stream text link that we will get our host to once again put in the chat. So if you would like to open up a second window to view the captions for today's webinar, you can do that as well. If the host could put that back in the chat, that would be fantastic. At the end of the webinar, we will have a time for question and answers with our panelists. We will use the Q&A function at your toolbar on the bottom of your screen. So once again, if you have questions that pop up throughout the webinar, just type those in the Q&A feature and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. So let's get started. I, once again, am so excited to be joined by 3 influential leaders in the disability community. We have Dr. Kara Ayers, Imani Barbarin, and Mia Ives-Rublee. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce yourself briefly with your name, pronouns, and visual description, and then I will share your very impressive bios with everyone. So we will start with Dr. Kara Ayers. Why don't you introduce yourself first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Kara. I am a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair, wearing an olive green shirt today and seated in my manual wheelchair. And my pronouns are she and her. Thank you.
Imani, you can introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Imani Barbarin. I'm an African-American woman with red below shoulder length hair. I'm wearing a plaid jacket and white top, and I'm before this very green background. And I've been a disability advocate for about 10 years, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Guess I'll go since I'm the last one. My name is Mia Ives-Rublee. I am an Asian American woman. I have short black hair. Am wearing a sort of flowery blouse, and I go by she, her.
Thank you all. So let's get into a little bit more about each one of you and your impressive resumes and backgrounds. So Dr. Kara Ayers is the assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at University of Cincinnati. As the associate director of the University of Cincinnati Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, she applies her professional knowledge, research experience, and personal perspective to make systemic changes to improve the lives of people with disabilities. Her areas of interest and research include disability policy, parenting with a disability, self-advocacy, psychosocial development with a disability, and disability in the media. She is the co-founder of the Disabled Parenting Project, a peer-to-peer support network for parents with disabilities. She has served for the past 5 years on the boards of the Osteogenesis Imperfecta Foundation and the Association for Successful Parenting. She is also a Paralympic swimmer from the 2004 Athens Games. Welcome, Dr. Ayers. Next, we have Imani Barbarin. Imani is a disability rights and inclusion activist and speaker who uses her voice and social media platforms to create conversations engaging the disability community. Born with cerebral palsy, Imani often writes and uses her platform to speak from the perspective of a disabled Black woman. In the last few years, she has created over a dozen trending hashtags that allow disabled folk the opportunity to have their perspectives heard while forcing the world to take notice. Hashtags like patients are not faking, hashtag things disabled people know, hashtag ableds are weird, and others provide a window into the disabled life while forming community. Imani is from the Philadelphia area and holds a master's in global communications from the American University of Paris. Her published works include works in Forbes, Rewire, Helpline, and more. She runs the blog crutchesandspice.com and serves as a communications director for a nonprofit in Pennsylvania. Welcome, Imani. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Mia Ives-Rublee. Mia is the director for Disability Justice Initiative at American Progress. She is a disabled transracial adoptee who has dedicated her life to civil rights activism. She began her journey as an adapted athlete competing internationally in track, road racing, fencing, and CrossFit. She competed at University of Illinois as well. She obtained her master's in social work at UNC Chapel Hill and began working with disabled people to help them find work and independence in their communities at the North Carolina Division of Vocational Rehabilitation Services. Mia is best known for founding the Women's March Disability Caucus and organizing the original Women's March on Washington in 2017. For her work on the Women's March, Mia was named by Glamour magazine as one of 2017's Women of the Year award. As a public speaker, Mia advocates on the national stage for the rights of disabled people, immigrants, and other marginalized communities. Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you. So today we want to talk about ableism. What is ableism? And ableism is a pretty new word, at least for me. As a disabled person, I didn't really know about the word ableism until probably like 7 years ago, which I find mind-boggling. And so we want to talk about this word, what it means and what it is, and how we can reduce ableism in our country and in our society. So there's a few different definitions for ableism. If you go to Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's going to say that ableism is discrimination or prejudice against individuals with disabilities. But there are also a lot more nuanced and in-depth definitions of ableism. The first definition of ableism that I ever saw was by Talila T.L.A. Lewis, which her definition, or their definition, excuse me, was a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. And that definition goes on, and it's more expansive, talking about how ableism is rooted in so much more than just disability. It's rooted in anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, all sorts of things that impact people on multiple levels. Last summer, when we were celebrating Disability Pride Month, Lakeshore partnered with a lot of disability people in the community, or disabled people in the community, to come up with our own definition of what ableism was to us. And that definition was: ableism is the intentional or unintentional, which is a very important thing to focus on, the unintentionality of ableism, discrimination or oppression of individuals with disabilities. So today, to start off our conversation, I want to ask each of our panelists here what ableism is to you. What is your definition of ableism? And when did you learn about the word ableism? Was it recent? Was it young into your life? Let's go ahead and start talking about that. So Imani, why don't you start and give us kind of your definition of what ableism is and when you kind of started learning about this term and word.
Yeah, so I view ableism as the structural, systemic, and interpersonal discrimination against people with disabilities. And when the definition for the term ableism is actually fairly recent to me, but I've been experiencing ableism all my life. And it wasn't until college that I really had words for what I was experiencing. And I think that that's true for a lot of disabled people, specifically ones that did not grow up with the internet or with social media, because a lot of our understanding has been through communal conversations regarding our own experiences and being able to put words to what we are experiencing. So it has been fairly recent that I found the term, but looking back, I can definitely pinpoint ableist moments throughout my entire life, starting with my birth. So I think that I'm not alone in that it's a new term, but we know and we can sense what it has been historically.
Kara, what is ableism to you?
Yeah. Like Imani and like you, Mary Allison, I think the term is newer than my experience, definitely, but I think it's important that we change that. So I use many different ways to explain ableism in my life, depending on kind of who I'm talking with or teaching. My 5-year-old is able to describe ableism in the way that she sees people treat us differently based on disability. And so she is a good reminder to me that non-disabled people are impacted by ableism as well. It's a detriment to all of us. In my college classes, I primarily use T.L. Lewis's definition of ableism because I also really appreciate the connections to other forms of oppression and marginalization. And I like to use visual representations of ableism to help me think of its depth and different aspects. So sometimes I use a graphic of smog because smog is something that we're all taking in, including us with disabilities. So internalized ableism, and my mom, when I was born, was not handed a smog mask. So she had her own messages of ableism, as do other parents who have children with disabilities. And that's something that's not talked about a lot, is pushing back on those. I largely see ableism as a collection of lies about disability, and we're missing out on a lot of things by buying into those lies. And I think the only other visual that I refer back to often about ableism is weeds in the sidewalk, which is like a common enemy of people who use wheelchairs like myself. And we can take the shortcut and just pluck up like the really obvious examples of ableism, but to do the deeper work, we need to pull it up from the root. And so that's why really countering systemic ableism is much of a driving force for me.
And Mia, what is ableism to you? And I would like to kind of ask one further question for you, Mia. If you weren't aware of the term ableism until fairly recently, what words did you use to describe ableism before you had this word ableism to use?
Oh, that's a good question. So let me start with sort of the definition. Um, I mean, nobody can put it better than TL. TL has a very good definition, but my basic one is discrimination and social prejudice against disabled people. Ableism characterizes disabled people as inferior to their non-disabled peers and specifically looks at productivity as a large means of describing who is worthy. in terms of society. I think that we need to understand ableism has been around since, the beginning of time. That it was a very huge factor within, as Imani said, within anti-blackness. Looking at slavery, looking at many of the horrific examples of real human crimes had been based on ableism mixed with racism, xenophobia, etc. Um, so just understanding how interconnected a lot of these isms are is really important when we start talking about how do we address this systemic sort of system. Um, in terms of when I found out about the word, or I was given sort of that tool to talk about, I think it was around sort of the time that uh, many of the other folks on the panel have said, which is around college. But I knew it was an issue even in the times that I was a little kid, and I knew that disabled treated differently, and that was very, very evident growing up. And so I think for me, it was always saying the ABs are at it again. Was basically how I would like to describe sort of the situation. And AB means able-bodied, which doesn't fully encapsulate all of what ableism is. But I just remember, particularly growing up in disability sports, much like you, Mary Allison, we would always talk about the ABs and what they were doing and how annoying they were. So that was my way of talking about it.
Yes. And we have already talked a little bit about different ways ableism is experienced in our lives. And, Andrew Pulrang, who is a fantastic disabled writer, he writes for Forbes quite a bit. He wrote a great article titled Words Matter, and it's time to explore the meaning of ableism. And in that article, he does a really good job of kind of breaking down ableism into two main categories. There's that individual ableism, which are kind of those microaggressions that we as disabled people can experience on a daily basis from other individuals. And then we have ableism that manifests in the social structures and institutions that we come in contact with every day of our lives. So I kind of want us to talk a little bit about both ableism, individual ableism, and then more systemic ableism as well, and give some examples of how we have those experiences in our everyday lives. So we're going to do kind of a rapid fire round. It doesn't have to be super rapid fire, but a little bit. So can each of you give an example of individual ableism? And I know a lot of you have traveled this week, so I feel like you probably are going to have some good examples. But can you give an example of individual ableism that you have experienced in the past week? And this could be intentional or unintentional ableism from another individual. And I don't have to call on you. You can just unmute yourselves and go for it.
I went to the movies this week, fully masked, all that stuff. But I dropped a water bottle and a man congratulated me for picking it up by myself. I wasn't doing anything like all that special. I just leaned over and picked it up, and he goes, "Oh my goodness, good job. So many people don't want to do things for themselves. Good job for you." I was like, it dropped. I picked it up. I was thirsty. It's not that big of a deal. I think that it points to infantilization. And then also I think just the week before that, I know it's going a little far, but I was traveling with Amtrak, and I was getting off the train, and I kept trying to tell this guy, "Please don't touch me." The red cap I took kept telling him, "Please don't touch me." And so I was leaning over the gap between the train and the platform, and he grabs my arms, which are attached to my crutches, and tries to yank me forward as a way to help me. But what he was doing was actually pulling me into the gap so that I would like fall between the gap. And I had to like yell at him to let go of me. So yeah, those are two prime examples from last week.
That is so
Yikes.
scary. I'm terrified of that gap. Yeah,
I'll go
you want
next.
to go?
Oh,
Go ahead,
yeah,
Mia.
I'll
Yeah.
go next. I think one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is how pervasive ableism is within our society. And so when I talk about ableism and the experiences that I have, a lot of people sort of second guess sort of people's intentionality first and foremost whenever I'm talking about the situations that I face that just make me tired. You know, they all sort of, we call them microaggressions, right? Where, you know, you have these situations that might not be super in your face, but they're there and you know they're there. But everybody's sort of second guessing your sort of perspective on the whole situation and thinking you're blowing it out of proportion. Um, but I would say, you know, particularly when I'm at a conference or something like that, I'm an individual that is shorter, and so I'm in my wheelchair. And I would say just recently, you know, was talking to a colleague of mine, and somebody just swoops in and starts talking to that colleague without addressing me, without saying anything to me, as in like, oh, your conversation isn't important as my conversation with this individual, so I'm just going to swoop in and break into the conversation. And you know, it's just sort of, you know, oh, people will say, oh, they probably didn't see you or something like that. And I would say, well, I'm not that. I kind of stick out. So I kind of, you know, the second guessing is always the secondary harm of a lot of some of the microaggression type of ableism.
Yeah, and it really is a cumulative effect for us. I think it stacks on top of each other. And so it's never just that one isolated incident for me. And that's what's also frustrating about people questioning it. You know, at this point in my life, I don't know that I really care anymore about intentionality. The impact matters a lot more. And so I am kind of in some ways done with the debate of unintentional or intentional, like the outcome is the same. And I mean, what came to mind when I was trying to think of an incident is interesting because it's almost the flip side of Imani's, and that people can't, they just disregard my answer when they ask if they can help me. And so whereas she was kind of praised for, you know, doing it on her own, I am like not allowed sometimes to do things on my own because people, you know, will say, can I get that door for you? Can I, you know, and sometimes it's a safety issue. Um, like, I don't want you helping me into my hotel room, even if apparently you think I look very awkward doing it, because then like I don't feel comfortable entering a hotel room with you standing there. And so it becomes this more than awkward, but like a safety concern too. Um, so I really focus on the impact, but I mean, like many of us, we move through our days experiencing this from start to finish. And, you know, I think in a lot of ways for me too, it's been a reemergence into society masked that has reminded me like, all the ableism that awaits me because thankfully I'm privileged that in my home I don't have to have those encounters.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch a little bit upon about like the intentionality, because like I think Mia and everybody here really just like saying, like people will do things and say and then try to gaslight us into believing that it's not as bad as it was because the intent was there. Nobody speaks to the intent when they're performing action, first of all. So we have no reason to assume that what they're doing is helpful. And second of all, regardless of their intent, a lot of times what they'll do is put us in danger. And because they don't view us as experts on our own bodies and our own needs, they disregard what we're saying because they've been taught by TV or by media or by government, whatever you want to believe. They've been taught that we don't know what we're talking about. And so they're putting us in danger with good intents, but at the end of the day, we're still in danger. So I want people to get away from this idea that intent matters more.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. That's a very important point that you make, and one that I think is going to continue to come up, because kind of how do we both collectively as disabled and non-disabled people move the needle forward so people understand even doing something that's unintentional can still be incorrect, if that makes sense, and cause harm. So I want to move the conversation a little bit from the kind of scenarios of individual ableism to the topic of systemic ableism. And this is something that I think we're really going to talk about throughout this conversation, because as we've all have discussed, ableism is just rooted in our society, in our culture, and everything that we do, society lives there. Or ableism lives there, excuse me. So can each of you give an example of systemic or structural ableism that you have experienced in the past week?
Yeah, I try to keep mine also when I was brainstorming about this within the same week, because I think it's a reality that we don't have to go far back to find these. And actually still along the thread of travel for me, many people in the disability community refer to the disability tax as like these additional costs that we incur. And many of them are rooted in systemic ableism. And sometimes they're costs in money, sometimes they're costs in time, costs and missed opportunities. So I think about how when I drive to my major airport that I leave my hometown from, I have to park in short-term parking, because while the long-term parking has an ADA accessible bus, it's never on the fleet. And people say, well, have you let them know? Have you given them the feedback? Believe me, yes, I have. But I cannot factor in the additional hour perhaps that they will add, firing up the old van, finding the driver. So I've actually had to get a formal accommodation through my work that my parking costs are more because I go through short-term parking. All of these are costs in, money to my business, which I'm privileged to have, a business provider that reimburses my travel. You can think about if this was personal travels. And also, for this trip, I'm in a different hotel than my colleagues who are working on this same project, because that hotel has recently had renovations and renovated away all of their bathtub options that were accessible to me. So I'm in a different hotel. It's a fine hotel, but what networking opportunities am I missing out in, from not being with the rest of my group and things. So these are hard to bring up sometimes, because I think, at least for me, I have this moment of like, do I want to share that? Because they worked so hard to find me this other hotel. And so again, that's like my own ableist voice trying to tell me that it's not okay to speak about these things. And so I'm glad we have the chance today, and I hope after today others will do so as well.
Um, so, one, to actually put a statistic out there that around what Kara was talking about, which was the disability tax. A lot of people don't understand what that exactly means, but for statistical purposes, individuals or families who have somebody with a disability within their family normally has to have about over $17,000 more in funds to live at the same level as somebody or as a family without somebody with a disability. So that's $17,000 more a year. So it's a significant amount in terms of a disability tax. But for me, I think it's sort of ironic, because I feel like we live in this situation where in order to receive services or accommodations, you have to be a certain type of disabled, right? So you have to be disabled enough to require specific accommodations, but you can't be too disabled or you can miss out on services or opportunities, right? And that's a very like prevalent issue within the disability community, is that you have to prove that you're disabled, right? To be able to get anything. But then, yeah, you can't be too disabled, or God help you, nobody wants to help you. And so for me, in the last week, I just got a note from my doctor saying that I owed them $100 because my health insurance won't cover the administrative costs of filling out a form for the DMV so that I can get my disability placard to park in a handicap spot or an accessible parking spot, and also have hand controls in my car. And this is documentation that you have to fill out every time that you get a new disability placard, or you get a new car, or you're trying to make any accommodations to your car. So, just another sort of disability taxes, having to fill out form after form and having to pay for it when your insurance company actually doesn't cover it.
Yeah, I want to jump on what Mia said about like these forms that disabled people have to pay for. Um, and I also want to mix it in with masking, because we present masking and COVID mitigation now as a personal choice, but it could have far-reaching repercussions for every single person in this country. And a lot of people don't understand that intersectional lens when it comes to regards to mitigation for disabled people. We have this idea that if disabled people stay home, or if they mask, they'll be so much safer, and then nobody else has to pause their life or inconvenience themselves for disabled people. The reality is that, and I've been trying to explain this to people online for like days and actually years now, is that COVID mitigation directly impacts disabled people's ability to vote. There are several proposed bills and now voting policies put in place to make it harder for people to vote on the basis of, election protection or election security. But that inherently makes voting for disabled people more difficult. And then there are existing barriers to voting in person for disabled people that make it extremely difficult. And then you add on top of that a pandemic in which nobody's really masked. We have basically given up on COVID mitigation. Disabled people are going to be discouraged from voting. And people do not understand that the policies that we have in place for in-person voting are still difficult for us to get around. To Mia's point, in my state, if you choose an absentee ballot for disability rather than just a mail-in ballot, you then need a doctor's note to validate that you have a disability worthy of needing that absentee ballot. And some doctors will charge you for filling out that form. So that is a voting tax. And then we ask disabled people to pay more just to participate in society, and not realize that every single decision that we make every single day regarding who we deem worthy of protecting impacts our health as a society, our collective ability to participate and to be in community with one another. And so you cannot look at a mask and say, oh, that's an inconvenience to me, and then be upset when people do not want to participate in the things you want them to participate in. So that is a clear-cut example to me of systemic ableism. Then you think of the fact that mail-in ballots aren't even accessible to every single disabled person. There are blind people that can't access them. There are people for whatever reason who cannot use them. There's signature matching that makes it difficult for people with certain dexterity disabilities. There's all kinds of barriers. And so when you decide that this is just a daily decision I'm not going to make in terms of putting on a mask, what you're doing is relegating people to making even more difficult decisions about how they want to participate in society. And that usually impacts the most marginalized among us. When you think about disability, every single marginalization leads to disability in some way. So when you think about the fact that you're disenfranchising disabled voters, you're disenfranchising Black voters, Indigenous voters, queer voters, because every single marginalization leads to disability in some way. So that is the biggest example I can think of.
And I love how you use the word intersectional, how intersectional your example was, and talking about how everything is layered on top of one another, and everything impacts one another. And you do a really good job, Imani, in your work of highlighting your intersectional identities, talking about not just being a disabled person, but talking about being a disabled Black woman. So could you talk a little bit about how those layers of ableism and racism impact your identity and your everyday experiences?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest examples is I always tell people that the stereotype of the welfare queen is a disabled stereotype. And a lot of people are like, no, that's just a racial stereotype. No, it's both. Um, and one of the things that I tell people is that when you make it difficult for people to access things like healthcare, a social safety net, food stamps, and then you predicate their ability to get more benefits off of their ability to have children, or to be in abject poverty, then people are not going to work. Like, people are not going to work if you punish them for working. And so when we think about the statistics of who actually becomes disabled, it's usually people who also experience racism or transphobia or homophobia, people who are disconnected from medical care based off of medical racism and institutional racism and things like that. And so our fates are very deeply tied together, as disabled people and as people of color and as Black folks and marginalized people in general. Our fates are tied together. And so whenever I think of people who kind of brush off ableism or think that it's not an important issue to address, that is one of the most important issues to address. Because if you cannot be anti-racist without being anti-ableist, you cannot fight transphobia without fighting ableism. A lot of the toolkits that are used by white supremacy rest within the confines of ableism. And because we don't address it, because we think it is a they, them over their type of issue, we're missing the entire picture. And so when you care for the disability community, you're caring for all communities. But we have to be intentional about caring for all communities in a way that is resonant with their communities, making sure that people have access to the resources that they need without discrimination or a lack of dignity. And so, like I said, I make it a point to highlight that all of these issues are intersectional with disability, because we are the only group, and as disabled advocates, I can tell you, everybody in this room hates saying this, but it's true. We're the only group that you can join at any time, and your likelihood of joining us really rests upon whether or not society deems you worthy of saving to begin with.
And of course, all of this impacts our identity. How we are treated and how we are deemed worthy, that impacts your identity and your value. And that can really lead to a lot of internalized ableism that we experience. So if we could have the next slide. And just talking a little bit about internalized ableism, this is the definition from Diversibility. Internalized ableism is a practice where disabled people internalize the discriminatory ideas and prejudices from our ableist culture and society. This may result in feelings of being lesser than or inferior, or feeling like you aren't entitled to certain things due to your disability. Just like Imani was talking about, feeling not worthy because you were treated not as worthy. And then the second definition was the one that Lakeshore collaborated with other local disabled people to develop last year, which said internalized ableism is when a disabled person feels they are less worthy because of their disability. It is the discrimination and ableist narrative people with disabilities reflect onto themselves. So I want to talk a little bit about internalized ableism right now, and maybe share, Kara, do you have a story from maybe the first time you kind of recognized internalized ableism, whether as a child or as an adult, kind of that first moment where you kind of realized, oh my goodness, I've been kind of taking a lot of this ableism on internally, and that's manifesting in other areas of my life. Can you kind of share a story similar to that?
Yeah, I have one kind of related to walking and one related to rolling. So I think like many kids with disabilities, walking was like the premier goal of like my physical therapy and surgeries. And, I was really praised for walking. If I, even walked short distances, like women would, grab their pearls and people would pray. It was very dramatic. And so I think, for a while as a kid, naturally, I bought into that. And I, thought that my goal should be walking. So I definitely remember, finally being in community with other disabled folks and somebody saying walking was overrated, and how that statement just like, as a kid, I just kind of repeated that statement and it just really soaked in, and how mind blowing that was for me to think that, wow, like, yeah, maybe that's not the way. And so that was a fun one, I think, because I was able to, I didn't call it internalized ableism, but I was able to address it, kind of internally. Um, and, in college, I went to Wright State University, where I had a chance to be with many other students with disabilities. But really, that was my first time. Prior to that, I had been, the only kid with a visible disability growing up in my small town. And so I remember not understanding why my friends in power chairs would like go super fast to class. I would try to kind of like moderate my speed to be more like a walker speed. And so, but as I got to thinking more about it, I was like, why am I defaulting? Like, why are they setting the norm? And so, yeah, I definitely don't practice that now. I have a Firefly attachment for my chair and I fly whenever I can. And I don't, use my like baseline as non-disabled people's speed or the way they do things. If anything, I look to our disabled community kind of to set our norms.
And Imani, I think Kara's story just reminded me, I was recently listening to your podcast, your episode on internalized ableism, and I think you had a similar story about your walking speed related to your internalized ableism. Do you remember that story and could you share it?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that still happens to me. So I was talking about how when I will walk, I walk super fast and I'll walk like I'm rushing, even though I have nowhere to rush to. All in the idea that like I'm holding somebody up behind me or that I'm walking too slow for the person behind me. And after a while, I just was like, I'm not going anywhere important. I'm dropping off the trash to the trash can. Or I'm just doing a random errand. Like it doesn't matter how fast I walk. Like I'm overexerting myself for no reason. And I think like I still every so often catch myself doing that, rushing and then huffing and puffing and heavy breathing and like exhausted by the time I'm done because I haven't paced myself. And it's still difficult to get over. And more so now, I think what's difficult for me is mobility aids because I've been on crutches since I was 5 years old. And I've been using my arms, my shoulders to hold up my body weight since I was 5. And so now my shoulders and arms and forearms are deteriorating and I have a wheelchair. But I don't use it because I like I said before, systemic ableism makes it difficult for me to want to use my wheelchair because I'm somebody who travels a lot for work, and a third of all wheelchairs that travel through airlines are broken. Like, should I really be using a wheelchair if it's going to be broken, if I need to travel? Like, all these things race through my mind. Like, and then also, how am I going to get around in my wheelchair if there's no accessible Ubers or taxis or or bus systems around me? Like, it's one of those things where it's like, yes, internalized ableism exists, but a lot of times society confirms our worst fears about our needs and about taking on our needs as disabled people. So I think I still struggle with internalized ableism, and I don't want anybody listening to the work that I do to believe that I don't, because I think that's disingenuous, and it sets us all up to fail to believe that we don't still struggle with these things. But yeah, I think that our society, disabled people have reasonable have reasonable fears about living in society in the bodies that they have, due to how we enforce this fear of disabled bodies and minds.
Definitely. And Mia, do you have kind of any experiences, maybe either currently as an adult or as a kid that you really recognize as internalized ableism that you experienced?
It, it was interesting because I was actually very lucky that I got involved in disabled sports pretty early on in my life. I started in middle school on a wheelchair track team, and sort of got to get sort of inoculated with the community pretty quickly, to the point where, you know, like, I very much didn't have any interest in walking, and you know, like, hated PT, hated anything that like required me to get out of my chair. And so, but what I would like to say specifically is, like, the thing is that even when you are within a big community of individuals with disabilities, is that internalized ableism is so pervasive. And ableism in general is so pervasive. You look at our general language, how we use language, saying crazy, that insane, lame, etc. I mean, any of that will show you just how pervasive, you know, ableism is within our society. So, you know, unfortunately, there was quite a bit of ableism within the disability sports community, and it was very interesting because, you know, there's definitely specific disability aids that you weren't supposed to be utilizing as a disabled athlete. So, like, having wheelie bars on the back of your chair, or having armrests. God forbid you have armrests on your chair, or push handles on your chair. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it was very pervasive, and it's still something that like runs in my head every once in a while when I'm like, you know, pass by somebody, I'm like, oh, I wonder why they have or why they have armrests on there, blah blah blah. And it's just, you know, something that I grew up in, and continue to sort of struggle with. And as Imani and Kara both said, you know, like, I'm getting older. It means that I have put a lot of stress, particularly from adaptive sports. I've put a lot of stress on my arms and my shoulders, and so I have started using some of the aids that I like adamantly did not want to have for the longest time, and continue to sort of try and struggle with the fact that I'm using those aids. Yeah.
I just want, do you mind if I just bring up one thing? Because Mia brought it up. So it's Mia's fault if we run over.
Go for it. Hey, you do what you want to do.
But Mia brought up like a really interesting point. I think we don't talk about lateral ableism as a result of internalized ableism enough, because like this comparison between disabled people about like what's the right way to have a disability, what's the wrong way to have a disability, is as harmful as a lot of times as our internalized ableism, and it is a symptom of it. And I think it's really interesting to watch because you could always tell who is dealing with internalized ableism based off of how they treat other disabled people. And it's kind of this like policing of disability that is detrimental to our community about who's real or who's faking, or based off of mobility aids and all these things. So I just want people to be mindful that if we do not deal with our internalized ableism, we are projecting that onto other people, and it is harmful to our community as a whole.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And I actually had never heard of it referred to as lateral ableism before. So thank you for teaching us that word today. And that was actually going to be part of our conversation, kind of going a little bit further, of just how internalized ableism really is a detriment to the disability community. and how in our previous webinar, we talked about disability hierarchies and how we kind of label some people, some disabilities as better than others and worse than others, and how our own internalized ableism really does not do a service to us as disabled people in our community. So thank you for bringing that up and teaching us that new word. So we're going to move along in the conversation. And if we could get the next slide, please. So I think we have clearly established, where is ableism? It's everywhere. Ableism exists everywhere. And today we really want to focus, since our audience are individuals who kind of work in the professional space of maybe healthcare, medicine, adapted sport, physical activity, folks who are interacting with people with disabilities on a daily basis. We really wanted to talk about ableism in these spaces specifically. We can see ableism everywhere, from in employment, economics, language, media, but we wanted to hear from you three, our panelists, about ableism kind of that lives in the different spaces where you work and where you've had experience. So I would like to start with Dr. Kara Ayers and talk with you about kind of how you see ableism in the healthcare and medical space as both a professor and a clinician. So can you talk about some of the most common forms of ableism that you find in healthcare and medicine?
Yeah, I mean, ableism is really baked into the training of our medical professionals, unfortunately. So a lot of the work that I do with residents or physical therapists, occupational therapists, I work with about 16 different disciplines, is helping them unlearn what they've learned, which is, I guess, a different form of teaching. They're also working within an environment that's not accessible, which is shocking to a lot of them to learn because they think of a hospital as accessible, but far too few clinics have wheelchair accessible scales. So we have, women with disabilities who are pregnant people that are not being weighed their entire pregnancy, which can have really detrimental effects to their outcomes. So I'm kind of helping people connect the dots in all these different ways that ableism pops up and trying to raise the alarm of urgency that some of these things we need to address immediately. And I see aspects like the accessible medical equipment, like adjustable exam tables, and really coming up to speed as we were expected to, more than 30 years ago, as like a past due item. And then also working every day in the education and the training aspect. And I really see accountability as critical. A lot of our healthcare systems have important diversity initiatives, but many are missing a connection to disability in any way. And it's more so than just writing it in, say, a recruitment plan. When I, work with healthcare settings that are kind of adding in disability, I'm also asking them, how are you measuring how many healthcare providers with disabilities you're recruiting? How are you supporting them once they're here? You want them to stay, and then how are you measuring how many are staying? So I also would add, emphasizing that disability is a critical part of that diversity component, which we're seeing and hearing pop up more in healthcare, which is a good thing. But it's never ending work.
And Mia and Imani, I know Imani, you said your first experience with ableism was at your birth. So I think we've all kind of experienced medical ableism throughout our lives, especially as people growing up with disabilities. So Mia and Imani, could you share kind of maybe a pivotal kind of experience you had with medical ableism, or maybe a recent experience that you had, kind of an ableist situation as a child or as an adult in the medical setting?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is really interesting is a lot of times like a small little paper cuts every single time you go to the doctor. But some of the biggest ones that are really like infuriating that happen constantly, especially with new doctors or new physicians, is It's kind of like a mix of medical racism and medical ableism. And I can never tell which is which. Like no, like people are like, were you experiencing ableism? Were you experiencing racism? Like, I don't know, but I know I was uncomfortable. But I remember I was going to a new doctor, and I think I was like in my early 20s, and I always bring like somebody with me as a Black woman going to the doctor, because there's a lot of medical gaslighting that goes on. There's also like a lack of care for our mental state anytime we hear bad news. So I bring somebody with me to make sure that like they're keeping notes so that I'm not as distracted, or if I get emotional or distracted, somebody is still on task. And I brought my mom to this doctor's appointment. She was happy to be there. She's always in my business to begin with. So like the doctor said something, and the doctor refused to actually acknowledge me, but was only talking to my mom. Because there's this idea that like I'm not the director of my own medical care, and so would only talk to my mom. But my mom is petty, like the core of her personality is pettiness. So she would just like anytime the doctor would ask her a question, my mom would sit there like this, like, and not answer her, and then the woman would kind of get the hint after a while and be like, oh, okay, and just start directing questions at me. But that happens all the time, regardless if it's a medical setting or not. Um, I've also lived in nursing homes, because accessibility at home wasn't what it could have been given my injury. Like our accessibility is very mercurial depending on our state of being. And so I broke an ankle. Um, that is another funny story, but I broke an ankle and I was stuck in a nursing home for 2 months because I couldn't go home, and I was literally begging to like try to like learn how to walk and like re-walk, and services were very difficult because they're understaffed. We don't invest enough money as we should into home and community-based services. Don't get me started. But I was arguing every single day with my physical therapist, when can I go home? When can I get home? Because I knew that this place was gonna like really quash my spirit. And that's a situation that we put disabled people in every single day. And some of the most able settings are settings that are designed for disabled people. Yeah, so those are a couple examples for me.
I think one of the biggest things that I've learned, and I mean, this is, uh, sort of a privilege for me because I do have insurance, is that you have to find a doctor that you trust, that trusts you. Uh, and I say that because, I have a very, very complicated medical history, as many of us do, particularly when you've had a disability all your life, or most of your life. And so, I can sit there and give an extremely long medical history, right? And talk about, the different medical conditions that I am dealing with, utilizing a lot of the medical terms that are supposed, that doctors use. And sometimes that makes doctors very suspicious of you, as if you're seeking care that you don't need, or that you're an opioid abuser or something like that. And so I had this conversation with this nurse practitioner, um, just basically giving her a summary of all of the sort of um, issues that I was having at that time. And she spent most of the time trying to correct me whenever I did utilize a word incorrectly. If I said shoulder instead of scapula or something like that. Um, and then, I just got this major feeling of just like she thought I was seeking opioids. Like that was her whole like idea and thought process, in the whole conversation. And so, um, when I left that time, I realized that this doctor doesn't trust me. I don't trust this doctor. And so I actually had to change providers just because, you know, even though that, changing providers is a headache because then you have to tell them your whole medical history all over again. But, it's just sometimes it's just this feeling that you get when you're interacting with somebody. You can't really put your finger on it, but sort of like Imani says, was it racism? Was it ableism? You just know something is not right in that situation. Um, and I've been lucky enough to have parents like Imani who helped sort of teach me how to be a self-advocate and make sure that my needs were taken care of.
Yeah, everyone's examples were fantastic. And I think something that I know, I feel like your experiences, I also resonate with me just on a regular basis, just interacting with healthcare. And so we want to shift a little bit from healthcare also to talking about what you brought up a few minutes ago, Mia, was kind of the adapted parasport world and different forms of ableism that we find in that space. And Kara, you grew up as a para swimmer and you were a Paralympic swimmer. And so can you talk a little bit about any kind of ableism that you experienced as a disabled athlete kind of in that space?
Yeah, it was interesting because most of my training, I was again like the only swimmer that worked with my coach or the only swimmer that was going to national and international competitions. And so I was really excited when I got merged to a team, Team USA. But there were also some real wake-up calls in terms of different forms of ableism that I hadn't expected. My particular disability is osteogenesis imperfecta, so my bones break easily. So there was a lot of kind of over dramaticism, I think is how I would describe it, about people deciding that I may break doing this or I may break doing that. And I mean, the interesting thing about my disability is that it's not always that predictable. And so really just letting me be the expert of what's too risky and what's not was important. I also noticed at the time of my games, there was a movement towards eliminating coaches that primarily had a history of working with disabled athletes and instead replacing them with high profile coaches of non-disabled athletes. And that wasn't the best fit for me because many times those coaches didn't want to work with me, to be frank. My stroke they aren't comparable to a non-disabled athlete. So literally on the pool deck, you have your lanes divided by kind of your speed usually. And I mean, you could often see the coaches like clustered on the faster, less disabled side of the pool. And so I think there definitely a blend is important. Coaches that at least are comfortable working with people with disabilities, and that includes understanding our lives outside the pool or off the track, recognizing all the things that we've talked about today. I mean, even the touch points that we've had on travel, all of that is so relevant for your athletes, and whether they be, Paralympic level competitors, or I love watching youth sports and seeing kids, as Mia mentioned, get involved in that community. But kids are dealing with this too in schools and even at home with their parents. And so having coaches and professionals who are in adapted sports and physical fitness fields be aware of ableism is an important contributor to their work.
Right. And of course, ableism is not just in high level elite adapted sport. Ableism is a barrier to people with disabilities participating in just physical activity in general. Imani, can you speak to maybe some barriers you've had growing up with a disability and as an adult having a disability, barriers you've had to physical activity? And what role have you seen fitness and physical activity play in your life? And how has it been categorized and recommended to you by others?
Um, so I, I was always one of those people where like the instant I got an inkling you were feeling sorry for me or weren't challenging me, I was gone. So when I was little, I really wanted to be a ballerina. And so my mom like well, first of all, my mom spent a year pestering our local dance studio into doing a dance for disabled kids. And she didn't want to do it because she like, this is a liability. I can't have disabled kids here. And finally they convinced her to do it. And when she did it, we were doing the same things year in and year out regarding dance. I was like, do I learn any new skills now? Or like, are we going to actually do anything that is like challenging to us? Or are we just going to do the same exact roles over and over and over again? And so I dropped it because I was like, I don't like this idea that you don't want to challenge me when my goal, like going into this, was to be challenged and was to be the best that I want to be, not for you to just have a class and have me sit there and have everybody sit there feeling sorry for me. No, I want to be good at what I do. And as I got older, people always like, I'm also fat, so people always presented exercise as like a way out of my fatness and like as a way for people to treat me better. Like that was always the goal. Like if you're thinner, people will treat you so much better because it'll show that you actually love yourself, and then people will love you because you love yourself, which is bull crap. Like and so I always had like a really complicated relationship with movement, because not only was that like the end goal, but I've been in physical therapy since I was 2 years old. And so I was sick of it by the time I was 10. And then for people to present it as like this end goal of me being able to participate in society in the ways that I wanted, I resented that. And I still resent it to this day. So I have a very complicated relationship with it. I actually for like 2 years trained to try out for the Paralympics. I'm actually a very good swimmer. But I was always worried that like I was too fat to participate, because again, even if I'm disabled, my fatness gets in the way of me participating in disabled things. So I've always had a really complicated relationship with movement and exercise. And I was always somebody who was in the arts as a kid. I was playing music. I played viola for like 10 years, played the Kimmel Center, all these different things. And then I started getting inklings that like the reason I'm here is because people feel sorry for me, or because they just want a disabled person on stage, not because there's any desire to challenge me or make me the best that I can be. So I usually walk away from those situations, for better or for worse, because I don't want people to think that I'm only here as like a token. So.
But I'm so glad you brought kind of your experience up, Imani, because I think so many disabled people kind of struggle with feeling like, oh, I have a disability. That means I need to become this elite athlete, and not having the space for just general physical activity, and just related to your health. And that can also be categorized by, what does your health even mean and look like for a person with a disability? So I think that is a really great perspective, that is not talked about enough. And Mia, I really want to hear your perspective, because I know for me, as I was kind of transitioning out of the space of elite sports after I had retired from Paralympic competition, that's when I kind of really started realizing a lot of ableism that I had experienced and ableism that I had participated in, and a lot of internalized ableism that I had. So Mia, you kind of transitioned from, adapted and parasport to this world of like disability justice. And how did that transition? Can you kind of talk to us about how you transitioned from those two worlds, and kind of what self-realization you might have had, that you didn't realize when you were in that space of adapted sport? I'm
Yeah.
not sure if my question made sense.
No, it definitely does. I always felt like an odd duck in adaptive sports. Loved competition, was hyper competitive, as I was growing up, and just loved pushing my body and figuring out like how it moved and how it worked. And I but I remember there were like 2 Asian Americans in all of this was before Steve Trioji was in the mix and all of that. So, like of sort of my group or age group, I was one of 2 Asian Americans in all of the group, and then there were like 2 or 3 black people. So in adaptive sports, racial minorities are very rare, which is weird. I mean, it's obviously due to some of the financial implications that and time implications that are required for adaptive sports. But I just remember just feeling very aware of the fact that I didn't feel like I fit in. And I remember going off to college, and all of the students I went to the University of Illinois, which is very well known for its adaptive sports. And I remember deciding not to go into the same dorm as most of the athletes were going into, because I had these other interests. And I knew that I wanted to do some type of service oriented type of major, and it was sort of there when I started experimenting outside of adaptive sports and started thinking of things that were going to be outside of adaptive sports, because I just knew that there was something else out there for me as well, even though like adaptive sports was very much in my life. And that was when I decided to study sociology, um, and ran into Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality, and just realized that she was able to describe the experience that I was having as a disabled woman of color, and this was much before sort of it became like the topic area that a lot of the progressive movement has been talking about. And I just realized how much it described my experience of not feeling like anybody was talking about my experience, right? People would talk about disability or they'd talk about racism, but they never talked about how those two sort of interacted with each other, and impacted people who lived within sort of that intersection, right? Um, and so, I continued to go on and just began to realize that that the focus on adaptive sports and staying in that area was just not a good fit for me. Um, and I still love and attribute a lot of my success to being in adaptive sports, and I think it helped me learn how to plan my life and how to push myself and how to test myself. But for me, it was a realization that there was another part of myself that I wasn't nurturing and wasn't learning about in terms of intellectually, etc. And so, it was sort of a natural fit for me to sort of take what I learned from adaptive sports, again around goal setting, planning, etc., and utilize it in my own advocacy work, and learning how to um, sort of test myself and test my ideas and test my thoughts, and come up better for myself, right? And always testing and improving things. So, it was a pretty easy shift for me to go from one to the other than I still miss some of the camaraderie that I got from adaptive sports. But yeah, it was a pretty easy shift. I think in terms of my changing ideas about what ableism actually meant, I think, I do look back sometimes and think, oh man, like that some of the stuff, the activities that I participated in were based on a lot of internalized ableism and like the type of joking that we would do when kids would come in and we'd like tear off their hand, their armrests and their wheelie bars and stuff like that. And while some of it was actually good for individuals to understand, like they can test themselves, they don't have to take or believe what professionals are telling them that they can do. But also, it can be detrimental to some people if they're not ready to take that next step, or if it just doesn't fit within their current situation.
Definitely, definitely. And so we've talked for, I believe, like an hour so far about, identifying ableism. But I think we cannot let this conversation end without talking about, okay, what are we going to do about not just identifying ableism, but reducing ableism and eliminating ableism. So that's where I want us to kind of finish up our conversation with how do we, as individuals and as organizations and professional fields, identify and reduce ableism. So that's kind of my first question. Focusing on the individual ableism, where we started our conversation. How do we, as disabled or non-disabled individuals, how do we identify when we are doing something that is rooted in ableism or something that is ableist? How do we identify that? Kara, what do you think? How do we identify when we're being ableist?
I think first it's helpful to just consciously lower our shields of defensiveness. There can really be a first response to, especially I think those of us that, work in social justice places and with people, there can be this mindset of like, this is like an other people's problem that I'm fighting against every day. And it's really, all of our challenge. And so stepping back from that defensiveness is important, and recognizing that we've all been taught these lies. And so we have to unlearn that and undo the hold that ableism has on our interpersonal relationships. And then, how that magnifies to a systemic level. But identifying it is the first step, and then putting words to it, naming it is so important. And it is so meaningful when non-disabled allies, pick up some of the weight that we have and call ableism for what it is. Whether it be kind of us calling out people, which is sometimes necessary, or calling in people to realize that their actions or inactions, which are often also the case, we're ableist and had an impact on people.
What would you say, Imani, to an individual who's just, wants to be an ally, wants to be better, wants to, dismantle ableism, but first has to learn how to identify when they are participating in ableist actions?
Well, I think the first thing is to realize that you cannot recognize ableism in isolation. We've been taught to be ableist since we were born. That's just the truth. That's not something you're going to get away from. But not being in community with disabled people means you're going to skip over those things every single time. You're not going to know what you don't know, right? So making sure you're actually in community with disabled people, actually listening to disabled people, that is the utmost and most important aspect to identifying what ableism is. Because you cannot confront the ways you're harming people unless you're in community with the people that are being harmed. And letting them be able to tell you exactly where you went wrong and where you could fix it for better inclusion next time. And I think that that's the most important aspect to any sort of advocacy is you want to be in community with people. You want to actually form connections with other people and trust them about their lived experiences.
Absolutely. And so talking about kind of different organizations, specifically organizations like Lateral Foundation, like, organizations that are working every day, not only alongside people with disabilities, serving people with disabilities. Mia, what would you say? How do organizations kind of identify maybe ableist policies or practices that they have in place? And how do organizations identify that and then try to eliminate and reduce that ableism?
Yeah, I think this is the suggestion I have for all folks around identifying ableism and the policies that go along with it. You have to understand the root of ableism, which is general consumption and production, right? And so it's putting a value on work, on how a body works, right? It's putting a value on somebody's body and somebody's abilities, right? Um, and saying sort of who is worthy of being invested in, who is worthy of being in community of, etc. Right? So we're putting values, and often it's monetary values on people's lives, and so which is why it's so rooted with racism and homophobia and all of the different isms, right? And so, in order to understand that, you have to start going through all of their policies, because almost every single policy that we put out there has some tinge of ableism within it. What I often do when I'm working with organizations who are like, hey, we want to do DEI around disability, and can you talk to us about like how we improve our organization? I literally say, all right, what I want is to see your employee handbook. I want to see your policy handbook. I want to see your general goals and plans for your organization, in order to be able to look and see, like, how often do you talk about disability? How often are your policies inclusive of individuals with disabilities, right? What does your sick leave look like? What does your accommodations policies look like? Because you have to start from the ground up. You can't just patchwork in things to try and improve your company or your organization's ability to deal with ableism within the organization. Because if you do that, you're not going to hit everything, right? So it's really important to start from the root of your organization and continue to build. The second thing is that you're not going to get everything right, and that's okay. We don't expect you to get everything right, but you better be willing to continuously improve. And part of that is actually putting disabled people in decision-making areas, right? One of the things that I talk to folks about is like, do you have disabled people in decision-making positions within your organization? And people will be like, oh, no, we don't have any disabled people working within our organization. And I sit there like, okay, have you actually asked any of your workers, do they have disabilities? Because 1 in 4 individuals in America have a disability, and that equation is actually probably a little bit more because of long COVID and the pandemic and its impacts on society. So the question is how are you including disabled people in some of your decision making? And it has to be actual decision making, right? It can't be an advisory board that comes in from time to time and tells you what you're doing wrong, and then you decide to do this exact same thing as you've been doing for the from the past. So again, really looking from the root up, being inclusive of disabled people, making sure that they have decision-making roles. All of that is important in sort of creating change within your organization.